Welcome to the presentation on culture. So today we're going to talk about what is culture and how do we get it, and we mean something very specific or actually very broad by culture, and we're going to be talking about the third of three big explanations for the evolution of human behavior. So we've discussed human behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology, and we saw how they had slightly different perspectives on the evolution of human behavior. Cultural evolution and the evolution of culture is kind of a third subfield. There's a lot of overlap between all three, but it's kind of a unique perspective. So first of all, what is culture? This is the easiest part of the lecture. It's just any information acquired by individuals via social learning. So anything that you know that you've learned from somebody else, this in biological terms is called culture. So this can include skills like knot tying, beliefs like religious beliefs, knowledge such as how to send a text message, ideas, and values. So these steaks look pretty delicious until I tell you that it's horse meat, and while many people might take a disgust for horse meat for granted as part of just something natural about humans, this is actually a culturally learned value, and like this butcher in France, French people have no problem eating horse meat. They think it's delicious. So culture is anything you learn from someone else. So it includes things that we classically think of as culture, like classical music, but it also includes swear words. If you've ever learned a swear word in a foreign language, that's socially learned information. It includes preferences for architecture and room size, marriage preferences, information about how we can travel into space, knowledge about how to tie different knots for fly fishing or where to go or how to do it. Haute couture and high fashion and hot dog eating contests, anything that we learn from someone else is considered to be culture. Culture in humans is quite unique. In non-humans, culture is limited to behaviors in animals' normal repertoire. So animals do have some social learning. Anything that is socially learned by other animal species, though, is limited to something any individual in the species could invent or perform. We see cultural traditions in animal societies, but these are short-lived and they're very rarely cumulative. So here's Emo washing a sweet potato on the beach. She learned that the potatoes distributed by researchers tasted better if she went and washed off the sand in the water, and this behavior spread through the group as other individuals took a cue from Emo and began taking their potatoes down to the salt water and washing them before eating. Rats are pretty good at social learning. They'll sniff other rats returning after foraging, and they'll take cues about what food might be available in the environment. And chimpanzees, of course, are pretty good at culture, and they have learned behaviors such as nut cracking and fishing for termites with wands of wood that they stick into termite mounds that the termites bite onto, and then they can pull the termites out and have lunch. So all of these are learned behaviors acquired from other individuals, but any one individual in a group could invent this behavior. And they're not very often, maybe a few exceptions in chimpanzees, cumulative. So it's not like you wash your potato and then you do something else to it. You just copy the single behavior, wash your potato. Culture in humans is very different. First of all, it's long-lasting. So these are some Maasai pastoralists with a cow. Dairy farming in some cultures goes back thousands of years. And so it's a very long-lasting cultural tradition of how to make a living. And so knowledge about how to keep cows, how to milk cows, how to manage pastures, how to manage herds has been passed down for generations after generations. It's been a very long-lasting tradition in these societies. Culture is also cumulative, and this is the biggest, most important part of culture for humans that makes it so effective. The fact that we can do something like invent airplanes. So one person learns something, passes it on to someone else. They can take that bit of knowledge, improve it, and then someone else can inherit the cumulative body of knowledge. So we're constantly tweaking what we know and passing on these improved bodies of knowledge. And what that means is by the time you or I inherit a body of knowledge, it's been improved for many, many generations of transmission, which means that we get a leg up essentially. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we want to drive our car. We can just go out and buy a car. So the fact that we can continually add on improvements to behavioral repertoires that help us exploit the environment means that we're more and more effective at exploiting environments. And this cumulative cultural evolution, this cumulative change over time in a population of knowledge, in this case, is essential for human adaptations. This allows us to adapt much faster to changing and new environments, and that's why humans can spread to every corner of the globe while the other primates are limited to the tropics. And it means that we can inherit increasingly complex learned behaviors so that we can both manufacture and figure out how to use things like espresso machines. We can do so at fairly little cost to ourselves. Now remember, when something is adaptive, it increases fitness or it increases reproductive success. So culture, in fact, increases survival and reproductive success because we can inherit complex learned behaviors that allow us to more efficiently exploit our environment. So let's take a more practical example than espresso machines. So, for example, if I were to say you're going to be dropped off in the Colorado desert, where it's outlined in red here, in the American Southwest, I'm going to give you 6 months of supplies, and I'm going to take away all your industrialized products. So no Swiss Army knife, no flashlight, no insect repellent. You're not going to get any of this, but you have 6 months of supplies. After that, you're on your own. Now, I really don't like your chances of surviving here after the 6 months. There's a reason why this area was called by wagons coming through as El Camino del Diablo, the walk of the devil. Many very tough, very desert-wise pioneers, Anglo-Americans trying to cross through this desert to get to California, died making the trip. But this is where the Tohono O'odham lived and made a living and spent their entire lives, where these pioneers were perishing. And they did so with just a few pounds of wood, stone, and bone, and a vast store of adaptive information about the environment. Everything from their social structure to foraging patterns, knowledge of horticulture that occurs only during seasons of rainfall, specialized technology for exploiting the environment, and an extensive knowledge of the desert. Now, did every Tohono O'odham invent this knowledge when they were born? Of course not. They learned it from their ancestors who were making a living in this environment before them. So just cultural information alone can allow us to exploit environments that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. And unsurprisingly, because we inherit so much of our body of knowledge and our behavior from other individuals, we can account for much of human variation with cultural differences. And we know this through things like cross-cultural adoptions. Kids who are adopted into cultures where their parents weren't born into are perfectly integrated into their adoptive society. Ethnic conquest, new ethnicity comes through, conquers an area. We see assimilation by conquered populations, and we see assimilation by immigrants into new populations where they become perfectly functioning members of their new culture. And we've said many times that culture is a really important explanation for human behavior, and this is in fact an ontogenetic explanation. A lot of human behavior and a lot of the variation in human behavior is acquired through social learning, is acquired across the course of our development, and therefore is under the level of ontogenetic explanations. So while we do explain most of human behavior ontogenetically, or even from a proximate perspective, The thing we do need an ultimate or an evolutionary explanation for is our capacity for culture. How come we have a capacity for culture so unlike other animals? Now, for every species, including humans, before we had an adaptive complex that included culture, culture is very hard. It's hard to look into the brains of others and understand that they know something different from you and being able to learn from others. And it requires others being willing to share information. So these cooperative complex that Sarah Hardy keeps talking about allows us not only to increase our inclusive fitness by all this alloparenting and everything, but allows us to share information. And once you're sharing information, this information can become incredibly adaptive. But it does require a combination of social and individual learning. So you learn a body of knowledge from others, you tweak it, you improve it with your own individual learning, and then you pass it on with your cooperative abilities. And this is what gives us that cumulative body of knowledge that is so adaptive. So it's quite difficult, and it does require a social species who's good at cooperation, who can understand that others have different knowledge from self, and who have long periods of juvenile dependence available for learning. And so this really limits you to a primate species, and it really limits you to a primate species as good at cooperation as we are. So we keep harping on this theme of cooperation in here, and it's really unique among humans compared to other species. One of the reasons which is it allows us to have culture, which is so unique and so powerful among humans. So let's talk about the mechanism, because we keep saying we need to understand mechanisms also. The mechanism for acquiring culture is social learning. And what we know about social learning is built on a body of knowledge called cultural evolution theory. Social learning patterns are what affects how bodies of knowledge evolve. And I'm going to show you some of them, and these are all built on both mathematical models from basically population genetics, and they've also been tested experimentally as well. So here are some social learning heuristics. Heuristics are rules of thumb. So these are psychological mechanisms that help you pick out what information you should learn from other individuals, because there's a lot of information in the world. How do you know which body of knowledge to copy and from whom? I'm just going to go through some of these. If you want to understand the basis for this dendrogram, please get in touch with me or take one of our upper division classes. It's a bit beyond the scope of this course. So let's talk about a content bias. What is a content bias? This is when you can see a cultural behavior of another individual or multiple individuals, and you can try out different options. So needles, for example. The concept of a needle is a learned behavior, and let's say you have two options. You can try sewing with a bone needle, or you can try sewing with a steel needle. Now, I can almost guarantee after trying both of them, and you can probably tell this just by looking at the pictures, you're probably going to choose the steel needle. It's just more effective for piercing cloth. Smaller holes, less likely to break, a better tool. However, this only works if you can observe the end result of the behavior. This wouldn't work for something like trying to figure out how to achieve an afterlife, because you only get to die once, so you can't do any comparison. In that case, you'd think, well, maybe we would try something more like a success or a prestige bias. You can't observe what the outcome for you would be, but you can look at cues of other individuals. Well, they're successful, they're taking this strategy, or they're performing this behavior. Perhaps if I copy them and perform that behavior as well, it will make me successful also. And we see this a lot with advertising campaigns of celebrities saying, I eat Wheaties, it makes me a good hockey player. Well, it's really hard to evaluate what makes a good hockey player. Perhaps one of those things is choice of breakfast cereal. So we're going to buy Wayne Gretzky's breakfast cereal. There's also a similarity bias. So you might try copying something from someone successful, and perhaps it doesn't pan out for you. And this could be because maybe they're just different from you. Sometimes it's really useful to copy those who are like you, and we see this occurring a lot in children. They prefer to copy other children who are just slightly older than them, because if they tried to copy the experts right off the bat, they wouldn't be capable of the entire complex of a behavior. So sometimes it's useful to copy those similar to you. Sometimes it's useful to copy the majority, so for a conformist bias, this is the when in Rome, do as the Romans do bias. If you come into a new environment and you don't know what to farm, say, you don't know what the ecology is like, a good bet is to copy what everyone else is doing, because if everyone else is doing it, it's most likely the successful strategy in that environment. Now you can see a problem with this, right? The problem is that social learning can be very quick, it can be very efficient, but can also be dirty as well. And because we're using these rules of thumb, these heuristics, to try and get the most adaptive behaviors as possible within a short lifespan, sometimes we copy maladaptive behaviors. And also, we're often learning from individuals who are not kin, like teachers and bosses and rock stars and political leaders and shamans. These individuals don't have our genetic best interests at heart, and like I said earlier, what works for them might not work for us. So we do see an explanation for maladaptive behavior. And remember, evolutionary psychology's explanation is, well, environments have changed since we evolved. Human behavioral ecology doesn't really have an explanation for maladaptive behavior. Cultural evolution says, well, we try to learn so much that sometimes it just doesn't work out for us. And so you see individuals doing things like rock climbing, which is quite dangerous, copying risky or harmful behavior from successful or prestigious individuals, or even things like focusing on education. Around the world, when women have more access to education, generally they start reproducing later, and overall will have fewer children. So education in women is directly linked to decreasing birth rates. Now, say what you want in terms of morals or reactions to overpopulation, but if we're only evaluating behavior from the perspective of natural selection in terms of what it gives us in survival and reproductive success, decreasing reproductive success is maladaptive. Not saying it's good or bad, just saying from this very narrow perspective, this is the perspective. So, what do we know about culture? First of all, it's unique among animals, or humans are unique among animals, for our culture being cumulative and long-lived. We know that ecological pressures can affect culture as people adapt to new environments. We know that previous culture affects culture. Remember, it's a cumulative body of knowledge. What is learned before is being continually relearned by new individuals. We know that it changes over time, though. And we know that culture is inherited separately from genes. It's an ontogenetic explanation for a lot of variation in human behavior, while the capacity for culture is perhaps genetically inherited. And we know that there are explanations for maladaptive behavior from cultural evolution theory. Okay, I'll see you next time for gene-culture coevolution. Thanks for listening.